Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Boost Your Strategic Mindset, presented by Edge Up in the Wisconsin School of Business. Before we get started today, I'd like to turn it over to Sadie, our partner over at the Wisconsin School of Business, to say a few words. Sadie.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremiah. Hello, everybody. My name is Sadie Schernicka, and I work in the Alumni Relations Office at the Wisconsin School of Business. At WSB, it is our mission to keep alumni like you informed and connected to the school through things like events, communications like our Update magazine, and our Edge Up professional development opportunities like this webinar. This fall, you can look forward to more Edge Up content, networking opportunities, and our fan favorite Homecoming Bash on October 22nd at Granger Hall in Madison. So keep an eye out on your email. We'll have more information about those Homecoming Bash tickets in early August. So we're really looking forward to that. Jeremiah, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Sadie. We really appreciate you being here today. So today's webinar is brought to you by the Wisconsin School of Business Center for Professional and Executive Development. CPED, for short, offers online and in-person programs, certificates that will give you the modern, relevant skills needed to advance in your career. All of our programs offer interactive learning sessions facilitated by instructors with practical business experience. CPED also partners with organizations to provide customized professional development programs, coaching, and consulting. For more information on the Center for Professional and Executive Development, please visit our website at uwcped.org. If you have questions during today's webinar that you'd like to ask, you can submit those questions using the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel. And to expand or collapse the control panel, just use that orange arrow. We'll post questions that are submitted today during the question and answer session at the end of today's webinar. I'll also want to mention that today's webinar is being recorded. So a link of the recording and a copy of the presentation will be sent to you in the next few days. And now I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Dr. Adam Bach. Dr. Bach is an award-winning academic, serial entrepreneur, and experienced strategy consultant that has co-authored 3 books on business models and entrepreneurship and published more than 20 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. He is also an instructor for multiple programs with CPED. Thank you for joining us today, Adam, and I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeremiah. It's always great to have these opportunities to connect with alumni and to share some of the ideas and thoughts that we hope will be helpful for your organizations and for your careers. Just a little bit more about myself, just to kind of get this started. As Jeremiah said, I am an academic. I'm also an active practitioner. I have co-founded a number of startup tech ventures, serving in executive roles. I've been involved in venture capital, and I do teach both at the Wisconsin School of Business and facilitate programs for CPED. These are some of the books that I've written that Jeremiah has mentioned, and some of the companies that I've had the privilege of serving as a co-founder and executive. And I mention all of this because I'm hopeful that somewhere in all of that experience, between the academic work, between the practical work, the executive work, the consulting work, somewhere in there might be something that's useful for you today. And I've tried to bring all of that together to present to you some of what we know about strategic mindset and strategy, both from a general theoretical perspective, but really also to help you think about how you can use it in a very practical way. So we do encourage you, as you have questions, please feel free to type them into the question box. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can towards the end of the session. So here's what we're going to try to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about what strategy is in order to then provide this background for your utilizing and developing a strategic mindset. We'll talk about this idea of strategy versus tactics, the concept of competitive strategy, and then a little bit about strategic planning, and then help you read that into how you can then be a more strategic thinker generally, and then obviously in your work environment and for your career. So let's start with a poll, though. Would love to hear what you think strategy is in the first place. And the way that we've got this set up is hopefully you'll be able to see a poll that comes up. You'll choose one of the four choices, A, B, C, or D. So we're asking you, what is strategy? Is it a plan of action or policy designed to achieve a major milestone or goal? Is it a deliberately chosen set of activities designed to deliver a unique mix of value, generate long-term competitive advantage? Is it a process of defining direction and desired outcomes, setting priorities, making decisions, or allocating resources? Or, hey, maybe you just don't have an idea right now. You didn't have enough coffee this morning. I usually try to give people an out, especially if they weren't expecting a quiz. And so that did it again, Brooke, where it GoToWebinar dumped to my desktop. So Brooke, if you want to just let me know if people can see the poll, because I can't see it and I can't see the results of it.
Yes, the poll is up right now. We've got about 60% responded right now. They are
Awesome.
coming in slowly.
Awesome. And these are anonymous. We have no idea who you are. We aren't tracking your responses. I promise not to give you grades or anything like that. Just go ahead and participate and let us know kind of where your thinking is. Which one of these is the best answer to what is strategy? And we do have this little technical glitch where I can't see the poll information or the results. So Brooke will probably, Brooke is our production manager here for this, or you can see what happens each time as it pulls up my desktop instead to show the results. So Brooke, could you just read those results out for us?
Yep, we've got 27% say A, 23% say B, 50% say C, and no one is feeling like they haven't had enough coffee today.
All right, I love it. It's great. Everybody's excited and ready to go and has thoughts. And this is what we see when people are thinking about strategy, is this challenge around how we define it. And part of that is because strategy is such a wonderfully broad word that people often arrive with very different definitions around strategy. So I want to try to give you a little perspective on this. Any one of these actually can provide you with a reasonable starting point. But in the most broad sense, what we want to think about strategy is a plan of action. It's a policy. We have a goal or something very specific in mind we're trying to accomplish. Now, that could be a competitive strategy, and then we can have a more specific definition, or it can be used in other ways. But it's really useful to keep this in mind, that this is our general perspective on strategy, that we want to step back to think about this plan of action or a policy. And one of the reasons we want to approach it that way is specifically so that we can distinguish between strategy and tactics, right? So strategy is when you do the right things. We know what that goal is. And so we've got this plan of action to get there. The tactics are those individual actions. They may be complicated, they may be very simple, and we want to do those well. In organizations in particular, it's essential that we're doing the right things and we're doing the right things well together. And this is often a challenge for people because many of us approach this in different ways. We have different whether we're very tactically oriented or strategically oriented. Ultimately, strategy positions the organization for potential success. And so having that strategy is the recognition around what it is we're trying to accomplish, and then we have to execute well in order to be successful. You need both, even if strategy sounds more exciting. And that is something we run into in a lot of organizations where strategy seems more exciting, tactics are sort of the grunt work. There's a perception that as you go up, rise in the organization, you should be doing more strategy, less tactics. That may or may not be true depending on the type of organization you're at. But both of these are essential to success. So let me ask you, we're going to do another poll here, and please forgive the technical issues as it swaps back and forth between windows. Which are you better at, right? Are you better at strategy? Are you better at tactics? Or is it about the same? So take a moment and just let us know, which one of these are you better at? Strategy, tactics, or about the same? And Brooke will keep me posted on how we're doing and when we've got the results.
All right, looks like we have plateaued with our answers, and we
Okay.
have 11% that said A, 49% said B, and 40% said C.
Right, so there's a limited group of you, and this is roughly what we do see at organizations, is that there's a smaller group that really feels like they're better at strategy, and then there's a group that feels like they're consistently better at tactics, and then there are some who feel that they're about the same, and that's perfectly reasonable. Let's try thinking about this in a slightly different way. Okay, now you may have the same response here, but you might not. So the question now is, which do you prefer? So given a choice between working and thinking strategically or working and thinking tactically, which one of these do you think you actually prefer doing? And I'll get the window back up there again. And of course, I give you an out. Maybe you're just not sure now that you really think about it. So take a moment. Again, this is anonymous. This is for you to kind of have the opportunity to reflect on what it is, how you operate, and how you can eventually build your strategic mindset. So take a moment and share with us which one of these you prefer.
People are a little bit more unsure about which one they prefer. We've got a little bit fewer answers, but 55% said A, 29% said B, and 16% said C.
Awesome, thank you. And that is also a very common sort of profile, that even though most of us suspect we're better at tactics, we enjoy working on strategy more. Now, some of that may just because of the perception in the organization that strategy is higher level, it's sexy, it's exciting, tactics is grunt work. But it may also be your personal perspective, that you enjoy that creative aspect of strategy, that you like the wide open thinking. And those are, it's useful to recognize if there's a distinction between which you're better at versus which you prefer. And part of the reason for that is because as I begin to talk about this issue around competitive strategy, recognize that you always have the option to bring collaboration in your organization. So if you're better at tactics, but you've been asked to think strategically, then obviously you want to build your capabilities around strategy, but you also always have that option to bring in collaborative capabilities from other people at your organization who are more strategic thinkers, and to be mentored by them and to learn from them. Remember, you're not solely responsible for solving all the problems at your organization. One of the reasons we want to emphasize that is to go at a very specific application of strategy. And this is competitive strategy. And Michael Porter is generally considered to be the global guru on competitive strategy. I had the luck to work for Michael Porter's strategy consulting firm right out of university, which was just an unbelievably powerful and compelling experience. And what Michael Porter said about competitive strategy is that it's a deliberately chosen set of activities designed to deliver a unique mix of value and generate long-term competitive advantage. So now we've shifted from that generic definition of strategy about a policy to get to a goal to say, here's what we're trying to accomplish in a competitive context, right? So our policy is that we have this set of activities that create a unique mix of value. Our goal is long-term competitive advantage. Now, some of this may feel like this is complicated. This is a lot to take in all at once. So let me give you a much simpler definition of it, right? Competitive strategy is, in other words, how we win, right? That's it. Ultimately, for for-profit organizations and realistically for most not-for-profit and other types of organizations, when we think about competitive strategy, we always want to come back to this perspective of how are we winning? How are we winning customers compared to our competition, right? So let me ask you how your organizations win. So take a look at this list of possible ways that you could win. And we'll probably have to swap the little page out here again when Brooke launches the poll. So one way that your organization could win is offering a minimum product or service that most customers can live with, and in the process, having a really low cost structure. Another way to win is having a product or service that specific segments need. They need something more than that minimum, and you charge them a premium for the fact that you are differentiated that way. It could be that you're trying to do both of those things. You have a differentiated product or service, but you're also trying to have a really low cost structure. Option D, you do something totally different than anything that's been described here. And as always, there's an out. Option E, you have no idea. You didn't get a chance to refill your coffee yet, so not prepared to answer this question. So Brooke, if we could have that poll in place, if it's not already there, let me know how the, I'll put this back up so you can see. Please, again, these are purely anonymous. This is an opportunity for you to sort of get a sense of how other people are thinking about it, to purposefully reflect on what it is that your organization does and how that relates to strategy, so that you can then think about ways that you could approach this perhaps differently into the future. So take a moment, share with us how you feel your organization wins, and we'll go on from there.
All right, we got 9% that said A, 57% said B, 19% said C, 13% said D, and 2% said E.
All right, so we got some folks who are prepared to say they have no idea. I always love when people are comfortable saying, I don't know. I have done a ton of entrepreneurship work, ton of strategy work, and I will tell you that that moment when you say, I don't know the answer to this question, that's when learning starts, right? And so I always want to call out the folks who are comfortable enough and ready enough to sort of open up to new opportunities when I say, I just don't know. So the bulk of you, about the majority of you, were comfortable with this idea of differentiation. We have a few of you whose companies are focused on low cost, and then we have a few of you who feel like you might be trying to do both. Here's what Porter had to say about this, and this is the dominant competitive strategy framework that's been in place now for about 50 years. And although there's lots of refinements to this and lots of additional ways to go about this, and we can also talk about multiple levels of strategy, corporate strategy, and so on, we don't have anything substantively better than this that's really predictive of why organizations win in the spaces they compete. Porter said there are two ways to compete. One is to be a low-cost provider that meets the minimum requirements for a given segment or market, and the other is to be differentiated, to have a different or better product or service across the segment or the industry. Now, differentiation can come in a lot of forms. It could be customer service, it could be speed, it could be quality of the product, lots of different ways that differentiation can play out. Porter also said that companies compete at different levels of scope. Some of them are very focused. Some companies pursue just one very specific industry segment, and some companies pursue very large, very broad industries. These are different, though, in how we look at this matrix. Porter said you have to be cost or differentiated. He said you need to try to be one or the other. Whereas your scope of competition, companies can operate at different levels of scope, very focused, somewhat focused, a little bit industry-wide, very industry-wide. When we think about it this way, we need to recognize that choosing one of those strategies is the key driving force behind what helps us win against competition. And I like to caution my clients and the participants who come to our strategy workshops and facilitated training programs that strategy is not a vision statement or a mission statement or a set of values or principles or even necessarily a growth goal. Very commonly when I go to companies and executives and I say, what's your strategy? They tell me something that looks like one of these. Our strategy is, and then they lay out a vision. Our strategy is, and then they describe a mission. Our strategy is embodied in these 5 values or principles, or our strategy is to grow 10% a year or something like that. None of those are strategies in the sense that they don't actually clarify how you beat competition. A growth goal can be part of your strategy, but only if your overall strategy is to be low cost through economies of scale. Otherwise, it's an outcome. A growth goal is an outcome. It is not a strategy. Your strategy is what gets you to that outcome. So as you approach this perspective of recognizing what your competitive strategy needs to be to defeat competition in your space, we can then step back and say, what is strategic planning? So strategic planning then is a process of defining direction and desired outcomes, setting the priorities, and then the most important part, making decisions, right? So many of my clients, so many companies that I interact with have a strategic planning process that just goes into a binder and sits on a shelf, right? That's not what strategic planning is supposed to get you to. Strategic planning is supposed to get you to a set of decisions and guidance on how to make decisions going forward. So what does strategic planning look like at your organization? So take a look at these options. Pick the one that's closest to what your company currently does. So maybe once a year, senior management spends a day or two, maybe offsite, maybe onsite, putting together a strategic plan. And let's be honest, sometimes nobody reads those things. Maybe at your organization, there's a continuous process of reviewing strategic position compared to competitors, adjusting goals, resource allocations to optimize your profit potential. Maybe one or more times a year, every group or division at your company puts together a strategic plan. Those are all funneled up to your executives who then use it to create an integrated plan. Maybe it's something else entirely. These three are probably not indicative of absolutely everything. And then again, once again, there's always the out. We have a strategic planning process. Maybe you don't, or maybe you're just not aware of it. So Brooke, if we would launch that poll, please, and if we could take a moment, share with us, what does strategic planning look like at your organization? Again, this is anonymous. We don't know who you are when you respond, but we do want to get a sense of where the cohort is and share what that looks like.
All right, we have 8% that answered A, 39% that answered B, 27% that answered C, 12% that answered D, and 14% that answered E.
There you go. So a little larger cohort that's not so sure about how strategic planning is done at the organization, which isn't that uncommon. The largest group is associated with the B, a continuous process. And that's fantastic to hear because emerging research in the management and strategy literature is suggesting now that companies that use a more continuous process for strategic planning outperform companies that only do it once a year for a day or two, or use this, even that use a bottom-up approach as described in C. This is something that appears to have come out of tech companies that have scaled up and that were used to operating on more of an ongoing process. Traditional strategic planning 20, 25 years ago, even 15 or 10 years ago, tended to be very batch oriented. The executives got together once a year, they had this conversation about strategy, they laid out goals and a budget, and that was it. And that was the end of the conversation for the year. And then at the start of the next year, they would look back and see how that plan did. And what we seem to be learning now from the way that tech companies operate in particular is that there's value in more rapid cycling through this. Now, there's obviously a cost. The advantage of doing that only once a year is it's very condensed. And trying to keep this up on an ongoing basis can be more time consuming. But the idea is not that you spend a couple of days every month working on this. The idea is that there's like a half an hour conversation at an executive level looking at strategic planning or at the divisional leadership level. And that's what we kind of want to encourage people to use from a strategic perspective, is not a one-time look that we then implement for a year without ever thinking about again, or even 2 years or 5 years, but that we're constantly coming back to this question of how is our strategic planning, how did our strategic planning play out? What is our competitive position? What kinds of things do we need to do to adapt and change? With many of my clients, there's this idea that strategic planning is incredibly complicated. And I like to try to point out to people that, in fact, if we go back to that whole concept of strategy and tactics, that's all we're trying to figure out, right? We're trying to figure out what are the right things to do, and then how to do them right, how to do them well. And for me, it all boils down to 3 very straightforward steps. Step 1 is, where are we now? Like, it doesn't matter how we got there. It's good to be aware of legacy, good to be aware of issues like culture, which tend to continue. But all we really need to do is to appraise where we are. How are we positioned compared to competitors? What are we doing well? What are we doing poorly? What does the business environment look like? What kinds of things do we suspect are coming? Step 2 is, where do we want to be? What kind of company do we want to look like in a year, in 3 years, in 5 years, right? How do we want to be positioned against competitors? What kinds of resources and capabilities do we hope to have at that point in time? And then step 3, we know where we are, we know where we're going. How do we get there? What are the strategic initiatives, projects, and the specific tactics that will give us the best chance of bridging that gap, going from where we're positioned now to where we want to be into the future. And yes, this can get much more complicated than that given the size of your organization. If it's a large organization, especially if it's multi-divisional, but ultimately, all of our strategic planning should come back to this very straightforward framework. And if you do this and you're constantly asking these 3 questions, I think you get a lot of clarity, especially if you've identified appropriate metrics and measurements for what success is for your organization. So what are good principles for strategic planning? And by the way, this at the bottom here is an article written by Roger Martin. I had the privilege of working with Roger, who was part of Michael Porter's consulting firm, on a couple of different projects. And I always thought Roger was one of those rare combination academic practitioners who could just say things so clearly. And this is an absolutely wonderful article. It's a little old at this point, from Harvard Business Review, about strategic planning, that I'd encourage you, if you're engaged in strategic planning, if you are required to set up strategic planning, or you just kind of want to think about why strategic planning does or doesn't work in your organization, there's a great article to take a look at. Keep the team small. I cannot tell you how many times I've worked with clients who have like a 30-person strategic planning team. That is way too big. You just can't get enough accomplished, because strategic planning requires voices, but consensus is going to be unlikely to achieve across that many people. Use a clear and consistent process that relies on data. Now, as an entrepreneur, I will tell you, sometimes you won't have all the data. There's nothing you can do about that, right? Either the data doesn't exist, or it's too expensive or time consuming to get. And sometimes you do have to make decisions without data. But where possible, use the data you have, and then acknowledge when you're making decisions without data. We wish we had this market information. We don't. And so we're going to make a guess, and we'll check it in 3 or 6 months. Don't turn that into company lore that's now untouchable because it's written in stone, right? We thought this was the market, and therefore we're never going to revisit that. If you didn't have the data, be aware of it so you can look for the data in the future. Know what your planning cycle schedule actually is. Is it yearly? Is it quarterly? Use this approach that we've just described, right? Step 1, step 2, and step 3. Where are we now? Where are we going? How do we get there? Situation, goals, and the actions, right? One of the things that Roger Martin points out that's so interesting is it's so much easier to work with costs than revenues. We know what the costs look like, and it's easy to project them into the future. But revenues are really hard to project. Sure, we may know where we are, but it's really hard to predict where they're going to go in the future. Much harder to predict than costs. And so the problem is that very often in strategic planning, we do both at the same level of detail. We do our cost analysis, we do our revenue projections, and we pretend that they are equally connected to data, and they are not, right? The odds are good that our cost analysis will be pretty close. The odds are good that our revenue analysis will be much less close. So if you waste an enormous amount of time getting those revenue projections down to the exact dollar, you've lost the value of it because you just don't know, and there are too many things that you're not going to be able to clarify. It may seem obvious, but write the plan down and keep it, in my opinion, short. Like a good strategic plan is a couple of pages at the most. 30-page strategic plans, A, nobody reads. B, it's just mumbo jumbo at that point, right? So sure, you may have additional background information. Maybe you have an appendix for specific initiatives, but the actual strategic plan should be pretty tight. Obviously, you have to adapt it as needed. If halfway through the year, there's a war, there's a market meltdown, you may need to go back and change that strategic plan. And then obviously you repeat on the cycle basis that you've identified. So taking all of this into account, right, recognizing that there are different elements in which strategy plays out in organizations, right? The broad perspective on strategy, the competitive strategy that we use to position our company against competition, and strategic planning, which is a process by which the organization figures out how it's going to get to where it wants to be. You then can wrap around that more general strategic thinking skills. And I'm going to give you a couple of these and then talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. Core strategic thinking skills associated with having a strategic mindset are getting comfortable with process. And for many people, that's very uncomfortable. This idea that the process is a part of the solution. Many managers, executives have gotten to where they are in part by making a lot of intuitive decisions. And that's okay up to a point. The world we live in is more data intensive, more complicated, and more uncertain. And we can put in place processes like the strategic planning process that will help us be much more effective as strategic thinkers and more able to implement complex plans. Increase the level of collaboration inside your organization and the level of collaboration that you personally utilize in order to make decisions. Because the world is more uncertain, because there's so much more data available and so much of that data is hard to assess, it's probably impossible for you to know everything. And that's why I'm so excited when I hear people say, I don't know, or I don't know how we do this, or I'm not sure how I would do that. Yes, build the skills for your own career perspective, but also look towards collaboration, identifying the complementary capabilities of your colleagues, your mentors, your managers, because that's where you're going to get the most benefit in generating strategies that actually work. And then this last idea of using reflection to avoid lock-in, and that might sound very strange, but the premise of it is actually very simple, which is the moment that you have fully committed to something and you are no longer open to dispute about it, no matter what the data says, no matter what other people point out, you are locked in. And that means now you have taken the outcome out of your own control, right? Whatever the broader environment and context is will determine whether or not your choices actually work. The moment you are locked in, you have committed without recourse. And so we encourage people to constantly take that step back and reflect. What data would I need to see in order to change my mind? What would someone have to tell me to say, I didn't think about that? Because the moment that we've given those things up, there's no opportunity for adaptation afterwards. So when we think about this in the context of strategic thinking and being a strategic leader, this is kind of a nice framework to use that I often talk about with my clients. This idea that there's this cyclical process, right? So yes, in the sort of strategic planning perspective, we have, where are we now, where are we going, and how do we get there? But in a strategic mindset, it's always cyclical, right? So sure, we can start with this perception of anticipation. What do we think is going to happen? Let's challenge those assumptions. Let's interpret what we can learn about the environment, about our options and opportunities. Make decisions. Align the organization to implement the decisions. Learn from the choices that we've made, and now we can anticipate what we think is going to happen in the future again. The key differences between people who have that strategic mindset and can apply it are the ones who are using a consistent process, right? When in doubt, they will make tough decisions based on intuition, but they constantly come back to this kind of cycle in which they're always evaluating and always open to new interpretations. They're also capable of learning from the past. And I know that's so cliche, and I totally get it, but the amazing thing is how important it is to keep that in mind. Yes, we sometimes change what we did from what we've done in prior circumstances, but always recognizing there's something to be learned from that. And then looking for patterns and trends, right? So here's one thing that happened. Let's not assume automatically that it will always look that way. Let's constantly be thinking about where the different data points can take us, rather than just focusing in on one specific anecdote or one specific data point that we got from only one customer, recognizing that it's those patterns and trends that lead to the larger scale opportunities. Why does collaboration improve your strategic thinking? It's not a solo sport, right? Data and knowledge demands are constantly increasing. If you create decisions without action or change, those decisions are useless. And collaboration makes implementation easier. If you do all this work solo and then you simply lay out the strategic plan for people, you're basically in a situation in which you have to convince them of it, as compared to if you've brought them into the process for the early strategic thinking, you get buy-in much faster. Especially in cases where you have rapid change requirements. And we've all been through this in the last 2 years now, where we've had to make radical changes in the way we operate, in the way we think about competition, in the way we think about markets. And in those contexts, that ability to make rapid changes is always improved when you have ongoing team efforts rather than one person trying to make all the decisions. And the hard truth, you're not probably perfect at everything. Remember the whole strategy and tactics things? You like one more than the other, but you might be better at the other one. These are reasons that you want to make sure that you're collaborating regularly. That's a critical part of having a strategic mindset. And finally, this last piece about reflection, avoiding lock-in. John Dewey once said, we don't actually learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on the experience. So sure, you can say, I did this and it didn't work and I've learned from it. But it's actually that point of thinking, why didn't this work? What could I have done differently? What circumstances might have made this work? How much of this was out of my control versus in my control? It's that reflection process that helps you avoid being locked into doing the same thing over and over again, right? Do I need to adjust the goals? Am I serving the team's most effective implementation, or am I accidentally doing something that's holding them back? And then the one that, especially as an entrepreneur, we always come back to is, have we made flawed assumptions? What is the critical assumption in this strategic plan? And what data would it take to suggest that that assumption's actually is not helpful anymore? So these aspects of process, collaboration, and reflection, right? Process, collaboration, and reflection. That's this critical element of having a strategic mindset that will give you the ability to operate at a higher level within the organization. So I want to stop there because I suspect that there are always really great questions. There's always no shortage of things that we can talk about. My information is here and I'm easy to find. I always encourage people, you're welcome to send me a LinkedIn invitation. It's always nice if you just say, send me a message as part of it to say, the strategic mindset webinar, because then I know, where you're coming from and it's easy to accept the invite right away. But my instinct is that you have questions around strategic mindset and strategic thinking or strategy more generally, and I'd be happy to try to tackle those. Jeremiah, can I turn this back over to you to kind of moderate the Q&A process?
Oh, certainly. Thank you so much, Adam. And as Adam mentioned, we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions. Just as a reminder, again, you can submit your questions using the questions box on the sidebar, and you can expand and collapse that sidebar using the orange arrow. So if you've collapsed it, open it back up and submit your questions. And we do have a few that have come in, Adam, throughout the course of your presentation. And I guess I'd like to start, why do so many of my colleagues, or this person's colleagues, and direct reports have difficulty thinking strategically? Sometimes asking them to take a step back to see the big picture doesn't seem to come naturally for these individuals. Do you have any recommendations for somebody that has that scenario?
Sure. So I think there are sort of two things to keep in mind here. So one of them's out of your control and one of them's in your control, right? So the piece of this that's out of your control is where this person has come from, right? And if you think about how we were all trained, right, in school and in college and maybe in our early work careers, and especially if these people are sort of more junior, they've been trained to get the right answer. They've been trained to think very tactically. Like, think about testing in middle school and high school and college, right? You were trained to do very specific things. And that bleeds over into this process in the workforce where people often, especially at junior levels, and even as they get up into managers or director levels, if they've not kind of been able to step out of that, they're very focused on this idea that there's one specific answer, and if they can just get to that, it's all sorted out. Our challenge as managers, as executives, as mentors, right, is to help people rise above that and to recognize that the specific problems that they are facing are local and that there are global problems at the organization and maybe beyond that in which they're a piece of that puzzle. And helping them step above that is difficult but doable. I had a wonderful conversation with a manager at a global electronics business, actually just last week, and she and I had a series of conversations. I provided a little bit of coaching to her, and we were talking about the fact that she has a colleague who's at her level, who's been at the organization, and he's actually a sort of an interesting outlier because he's been at the organization for 35 years. And we were talking about the fact that he's been very difficult about collaborating on some of the more innovative kinds of things that she wants to work on. And she said something really insightful, which was, as a result of kind of thinking more strategically, she's realized, he has his own set of incentives that he's kind of trapped with, and his own legacy at the organization. And if she wants to get him to be more collaborative, she's got to find ways to incentivize what she believes how he can benefit. She has to help him see that there's a larger purpose in this than just his group. That's not always easy to do, right? And sometimes in groups or divisions, there's going to be tensions between entities. But the starting point for this is recognizing where those people are coming from and the way they've been trained, and then giving them an opportunity to see the impact of what they're doing or the work that they do at a different level in the organization. And very often that's a really straightforward way of helping them then step out of that sort of focus, that little bubble that they're in. So it's a great challenge, and it has tremendous rewards with it, because once you help people like that get that better perspective, they're much more likely to be more open to collaboration, innovation, and other kinds of opportunities.
Thank you, Adam. Is there an optimal mix of strategic versus tactical thinkers that we should maybe have in the room or have in the meeting? Like, is a 70-30 strategist versus tactician, is that optimal, or is there an optimal breakdown?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I don't know the answer. So here's one for where I'll try to model the behavior I want to see. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think there's a definitive mix that's always going to work. If I had to guess, I think that the way to think about this is based on how much uncertainty there is in whatever the topic you're addressing. So imagine for a moment that we are a consumer packaged goods company, maybe something like Procter & Gamble, right, where we know what the products are and we're pretty good with data in terms of the market space. Whatever challenge we're facing has to do with, okay, we've got this product, maybe we need to retweak the marketing copy and some of the branding around it and our advertising plan. It seems to me that given the clarity, most of the clarity you have about that you're probably looking for more tactical focus, right? You probably do want some strategic people to make sure you're not missing the boat. But I think having a lot of tactical people, or a majority of tactical people, is likely to be more beneficial. If this is a very uncertain and innovation-driven or entrepreneurial environment, maybe we're trying to come up with a completely new product. Maybe we're entering a space where we don't have good competitive information. Maybe we don't know exactly what our goals are. Maybe we don't know exactly the resource base that we're going to have access to. In those situations, I think having people with a little more strategic framework or perspective and maybe a little less tactical focus is likely to be helpful, because you're not going to get bogged down. You're not as likely to get bogged down in details that actually it's too early to commit to. So for me, I suspect that one of the critical determinants of the optimal mix is going to be how uncertain the situation is.
Very good. Thank you, Adam. We had several questions come in regarding having a tactical mindset versus a strategic mindset. Do you have any recommendations for people to get out of that day-to-day tactical mindset and to start thinking more strategically?
So it's a great question, and I don't have like a regimen. I think the ability to think strategically and to apply a strategic mindset on a regular basis really comes from practice. Yes, I think helping people recognize the power of process and collaboration, right, and reflection. it's good to be aware that those are sort of the steps, right? Those are the pieces you need. But to get good at it just requires practice. And so, you know, if I were working with a group, if I were working with a manager and executive who was concerned that there was a specific group or division or functional area that was, you know, just too overly focused on tactical, my instinct would be, we need to give them opportunities to think strategically and potentially to fail thinking strategically. So, and you can imagine this is a little bit like riding a bicycle, right? I mean, you don't learn to ride a bicycle from a physics textbook. You learn to ride a bicycle because someone puts you on the bike and runs alongside holding the seat while you kind of fall down a couple times. And so to create opportunities in the organization for people who generally focus very tactically, and to say, here's an opportunity, here's a project, here is an initiative, we'd like you to come in, and to not worry about the details, to give them specific opportunities to put strategic ideas down on paper, and to make it clear that there's a support network in place, right? So they're not going to be solely responsible for it. They'll have a colleague, a buddy, or there's an additional review process. And to be clear that this is a training opportunity with real implications, but that they're not expected to get it, you know, to make it perfect the first time through. And I think that, quite frankly, is what blocks so many people from being strategic thinkers in organizations. Because think about it this way, right? If you give someone the opportunity to implement 10 tactics, right? Or you say to them, I need you to get from A to B, please write up the list of steps that we need to do and then implement those steps. I mean, that's really straightforward. And a lot of us who enjoy making lists and who can connect the dots, we know when it's right. You can just kind of do the work, know it's right, complete it, hand it over to your manager, and it's done. And you'll probably get good feedback on it, right? Like, hey, nice job getting that done on time. When we're asked to think strategically, it's often much more nebulous. Put a half-page document describing the strategic direction for this given product, how we should be, you know, positioned competitively against other organizations. What's the larger scale goal that we should be going after? There may not be a definitively right answer, and an answer that looks good now might not look good in 6 months. And so the problem is that very commonly, I think when we try to help people think strategically, we give them just enough rope to hang themselves, and then we hang them. We have to find ways to help people try out the strategic thinking and to feel like there's an opportunity to do it, maybe not to get it completely right, and to get constructive feedback that's going to help them the next time they go at it. Because it is, in my opinion, it's a developed skill. It's like a muscle that you have to build over time. And the challenge is usually not on their end, it's on our end, as managers, as executives, helping people move up that level of abstraction in a safe environment. So I don't know the definitive answer, but you know, at the companies I've worked at, the companies that I've led, where possible, you try to give those opportunities and enough space to kind of get it not right 100% so that people can learn from the experience.
Thanks, Adam. And to kind of speak to your response there, we do have a diverse group of webinar attendees today, and you know, not only those that are trying to seek out learning more about developing their own strategic mindset, but also those leaders that are looking for opportunities to upskill their teams and their team members. And as a senior leader, being able to put those individuals into the right experiences to develop that strategic mindset. Now, this is kind of a loaded question, Adam, and I fully expect you to answer it completely and go down whatever path you want. But do you have any recommendations for resources for assisting team members to develop their strategic mindset?
Yeah, well, I mean, the loaded piece of this is obviously I teach our business acumen and strategy program, so we pitch our own training work here, specifically the one that I lead, and we now offer that both in person and online. But that's also a big commitment. I mean, it is a multi-day, 20-hour plus training commitment, and not everybody's capable of kind of diving into that. And obviously, we CPED has custom programs as well. I think that a big part of creating opportunities for people and organizations sometimes is simply, giving them the opportunity to, access more information about the organization, and to encourage them to explore areas of interest that are specific to, that are their areas of interest, but also maybe go beyond their own functional area. I think one of the real challenges in organizations is organizations become big and successful through specialization, right? Think about it. When we want to grow an organization, we need predictability, right? Jane is my boss. Jane gives me a job. She expects that job to be done in a very specific way. And one of the ways to accomplish that is she knows the job is a marketing job, so she wants to make sure that I have marketing skills. And so the irony is that we bring people into organizations to accomplish very specific functional things. We reward them for doing those functional things, which creates an even narrower focus. And I'm sure you've seen this at many larger organizations where they have rotation programs. I mean, that rotation program process is not just about gaining additional skills, right? Putting a marketing person in the finance department, the finance person in the sales department. It's not as if our intention is to turn them into those other people, those other jobs. The goal is to give them that higher level perspective. Here are the 5 big problems the sales department is facing. Wow, I would have never thought of that, because over in finance, we just assumed they operated in a very specific way. Or someone from the marketing department spending 6 months in finance and saying, holy cow, I had no idea the company was dealing with these kinds of issues, right? That would have never occurred to me in the marketing space. And so even just creating opportunities for people to shadow or to be placed onto a project in another functional area, those are eye-opening experiences for people to step out of that knowledge base. I mean, one of the reasons, so to go back to the first pitch about the programs we run, one of the things that we try to do in the business acumen and strategy types of programs are to give people access to other functional areas in the organization to see what's going on. Oh, this is what you deal with. That's what you deal with. Because what we're really trying to do is just to encourage people to have that opportunity to rise above the day-to-day functional activities that they're required to do, and to realize, oh, it's a bigger world out there, right? There's more, people are dealing with problems that I'd never heard of before. So I think in terms of, there's no shortage of business books about strategy. There's no shortage of, you can find books on strategic mindset. There's wonderful, those HBR articles are a really nice place to start. But, if you want to start small, identify a couple of people who you want them to develop their strategic mindset, and create just enough time for them to engage with other parts of the organization. It's like travel. It's like the power of diversity. All of these things help make us more open to opportunities, more open to change. And that's really sort of that critical element of having that strategic mindset that I'd encourage.
Thank you. And for those that might be on a smaller team, maybe part of a smaller organization, or somebody that just has aspirational career motivations to learn or to be more involved in their organization's strategic planning, do you have any recommendations on how they might go about approaching their leader or an executive about changing that?
Well, that's an absolutely spectacular question, Jeremiah. Kudos to whomever asked that. I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I mean, so much of that depends on organizational culture and legacy. I would be a little shocked if, for someone to go to their manager or to someone at the organization and say, hey, I'd really like to understand a little bit more about our strategy or our strategic planning. I'd be a little shocked if the response was, no, you're not allowed to know that. it might be more along the lines of, oh, really, that's interesting. There's some things, you can't, you're not high enough level yet that we, we're not going to bring you into board meetings or anything like that. But, there's probably strategic documentation at the organization that could be made available. There's probably opportunities to sit on additional meetings. I mean, people need to be aware you're kind of volunteering to spend time, right? And where I think managers have concerns is they don't want that sort of effort to negatively impact your ongoing responsibilities. But I mean, I'm always very excited at my companies when, I have, either, junior staff or scientists or whomever and come to me and say, I really would like to understand our strategy better. I'd really like to understand how this planning process works. Where possible, we bring people in. I mean, obviously there are, like I said, board meetings you can't bring people to for legal reasons usually. But I would hope that people would feel like they could simply, start that conversation with a manager. I think it's always good to come, armed in some ways, to have a little bit of strategic thinking that you've done, to say, hey, I've thought about this and it seems like we're doing this. Just so long as you're prepared to be wrong, right? I mean, that's one of the challenges of the strategic mindset, is the possibility that you'll put a little thought into it. It looks like we're positioning ourselves against our competitor in this way. Is that accurate? And if that's true, why are we doing the following 4 things? Or I wonder if we could do these 3 things instead, because that seems like it would be more aligned with that strategy. And just so long as you're prepared to be wrong, or to say, oh, you didn't have access to this data, or this is the way we're approaching it. Yes, that's right for the next 6 months, but here's the longer term trend that we're expecting. So I think that openness to learning is really kind of the critical characteristic that you can demonstrate. And I would hope the managers or senior level executives at your organization would find that to be, appealing. They would find that to be an indication of enthusiasm, of commitment to the organization, and a goal of, becoming better at what you do.
Thank you, Adam. We have time for one last question. It's kind of a 2-parter. How can you establish a strategy that, or what would be is there a single best practice to establishing a successful strategy? And after you've established a successful strategy, how would you measure that it was successful, or how would you suggest measuring success?
Yeah, so part of this would depend on if we're really thinking about this from a competitive strategy or a corporate strategy perspective. And I apologize for being a little bit of an academic here to make sure that we're talking about the same things. So if, for example, we're talking about competitive strategy, which is how we win, then ultimately our measures are fairly straightforward. They're probably all associated with profitability. Depending on the nature of the industry, there might be some growth outcomes that we want to take into account as well. If we are looking at a corporate strategy where we have multiple strategic business units, each of which has its own profitability measures, then our success is going to be, success metrics are going to be based more on our capital, our cash outcomes, returns across the organization, positioning of the SBUs compared to competition. So it gets a little more complicated quickly. So our definitions of success around strategy are going to vary depending on where in the growth stage we are, if we're a startup company, mid-stage company, late stage company, whatever it happens to be. And getting to the best possible strategy, I'm not aware of a single best practice to accomplish that. And I mean, the reality is that there are certain people who just do it intuitively and instinctively. And there's no shortage of great stories about entrepreneurs and executives who just got it, right? I've forgotten, I know we like to focus on people like Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and, the Google guys and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, I think much more interesting stories are things like the great IBM turnaround, Lou Gerstner. And I mean, we can argue about, what kind of person he was and all that kind of stuff. But, and I've forgotten what the name of the book was, if it's Teaching the Elephant to Dance or whatever, I can't remember what it was called. But the story of how IBM made the transition from what was arguably, one of America's greatest hardware stories of all time to becoming a solutions provider. And of all the companies, you remember IBM was the people with the Oxford shirts and the blue tie, the white shirt and the dark blue tie. I mean, that culture was so stable and homogenous. And to transition that to an organization that became so much more agile, so much more adaptable, I think is, just goes to show you that some people like Gerstner just got it. They looked around, they said, here's the situation, we don't have a choice. This is going to be painful and difficult, but we have to do this. And then there are, classic stories of, teams that really kind of sit down and figure out where is the strategic play. And you can find a lot of those in things like private equity groups, KKR, organizations that purposely go out and say, here's the strategic landscape, here's where the money is going to be made. Let's go and make strategic investments in those specific spaces. And you can find simple examples of those. In the program that we run on strategy, we often look at industries. We talk about the PC industry and the chip industry, and we note that there's a very specific reason that computer companies have tried to become chip makers. Chip makers never try to become computer companies. And it has to do with using that strategic process to think about where the opportunities really are in a very, very structured way. So is there an absolute best way to do this? No, probably not. Are there better and worse ways? Yeah, absolutely. And so we really try to encourage people to think about the data, make sure they're using good frameworks and analysis to kind of think about what their strategies are going to be, and then look towards using these kinds of strategic mindset processes in order to execute effectively, because in the end, it all comes down to execution.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Adam, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. I'd like to send my thanks also to the Wisconsin School of Business Edge Up team for bringing us this program today. We really appreciate all of you joining us, and keep your eyes out for future webinars that will be coming your way. Again, I'm Jeremiah Gullin with the Center for Professional and Executive Development. Thank you so much for being here today. Good day.